I can't believe Parks and Recreation ended 5 years ago. Now more than ever, a little Leslie Knope in our lives would do us a lot of good. But if we can't have new episodes, the next best thing is to revisit exactly what made Pawnee so special. Time to treat yourself to 107 facts about Parks and Recreation. Parks and Recreation ran on NBC for 7 seasons, April 9th, 2009 to February 24th, 2015. But the show's origins go back to 2007 when one of the producers of The Office became a bigwig at NBC. He immediately asked Greg Daniels to give him a new series. Daniels was a hero at NBC for adapting The Office into its successful American counterpart, but Daniels' resume is impressive even beyond that. He was a writer for The Simpsons from 1993 to 1998. You know, the golden years. He also co-created King of the Hill. Daniels didn't want to attack this new project alone, so he recruited Michael Schur, a producer on The Office, to co-create the new series. Schur would later go on to create a few other notable series, namely Brooklyn Nine-Nine and The Good Place. When Schur came on board, he and Daniels had no clue what this new show was going to be. They didn't even know whether the show was going to be a direct spin-off of The Office or a totally new different thing. Though one thing was for sure, they definitely didn't want to make a satellite of Dunder Mifflin. In a strange twist, the only thing moving forward during this time was the show's cast. Both Rashida Jones and Aziz Ansari signed onto the project without really knowing what it was. The new project didn't take shape until Daniels and Schur recruited Amy Poehler for the lead. All three of them had cut their teeth on SNL, Daniels and Schur as writers, and Poehler obviously in front of the camera. Daniels first saw Poehler during the late 1990s when she was at the Upright Citizens Brigade. She introduced herself to the audience as an executive from a television network, and she was so believable that by the time Daniels realized it was a bit, he said his head burst open. In the beginning, Poehler quickly became the show's entire reason for being. Schur even said that, "My goal and dream of this show was to provide a showcase for her abilities. If it works and she gets to play this character for a long time, I'll have done my job." By then, it was the summer of 2008. Daniels and Schur noticed that the country was especially obsessed with politics and accountability in government. So they decided to put Poehler front and center as a bureaucrat, with Ansari as her subordinate, and Jones as the civilian, with the pit problem. The 2008 presidential election was right around the corner, so Daniels and Schur wagered that politics would be front and center in people's minds. And with the 2008 financial crisis that came later, they were completely right. Schur and Daniels then set to work doing research for the show. They sought out real-life city planners and government workers around the Los Angeles area, sitting in on meetings and listening to workers' captivating stories for hours on end. One such worker was Scott Albright, the city planner for Santa Monica, who would become the producer's go-to consultant for the first season. Albright even became the basis for Pawnee's city planner, Mark Brendanowitz. Paul Schneider, the actor who played Mark, went so far as to come to Santa Monica City Hall and shadow Albright and several other city planners. These actors take their research seriously. Schur also talked to urban planners in Claremont, California. He asked them whether turning an abandoned construction site into a park could actually take ages. And they all laughed because they had recently finished a park 18 years after it was initially planned. At one point, Schur was debating whether having the department head be a libertarian who didn't believe in government was too jokey, until he actually met one in real life. She was working in Burbank's local government, and yes, she was totally aware of the irony. Now that the show was in full motion, it needed a better name than Untitled Amy Poehler Project. Before landing on Parks and Recreation, the series was briefly called Public Service, but the idea was scrapped. They didn't want people to think the show was mocking that line of work. Some of the characters themselves were takes on political archetypes. Early on in the show's development, Schur said he figured Tom is what Bill Clinton was like when he was 27. Parks and Rec finally began shooting in February 2009. But there was just one problem. The first episode was slated to air in just 2 months' time. The writers began churning out 9 pages a day, which is an absolutely ridiculous pace for a sitcom. When an early test screening leaked, things started looking ominous. Apparently, the test audience found the show to be a carbon copy of The Office, and thought the male protagonists were sleazy. The media had a field day. That screening went through as many as 4 or 5 more edits before it became the final pilot episode that we all saw. There's usually 6 months between when the first draft of a pilot is shot and when it airs, but Parks and Rec didn't have that luxury. They had to move on to episode 2 the next week because the series was scheduled as a mid-season replacement. To counterbalance this insane time crunch, Schur treated the whole first season like a pilot. He's lucky it was only 6 episodes long. That's why the show's tone, and even a few characters, changed from the beginning to end of season 1. Daniels and Schur went with The Office's infamous fake documentary style out of a pure love for the format. Schur believed it was the best way to tell a story. However, Parks and Rec's rules for the format would grow to be much more lax than The Office's. Schur used it in Parks and Rec because, in real-world politics, the difference between what goes on behind closed doors and what people present to the public is a huge issue. The actors also had to grapple with how to react to the mockumentary format in a way that was different enough from The Office. For example, Aziz Ansari went with Tom's goofy smile. Aubrey Plaza, aka April Ludgate, tackled this hurdle by acting like April has a running inside joke with the camera where she's like, "Can you believe this?" Daniels and Schur also encouraged the actors to improvise. Daniels thinks improvisation helps ensure a better show, though actors were only allowed to improvise for a minute at a time. Despite all the improv, Parks and Rec still needed writers. And unsurprisingly, they recruited writers based on their ability to write a strong spec script for The Office. One of Daniels' goals as a writer became to make a script that would make Poehler laugh, especially because, as he put it, she has this wonderful cackle. Schur doesn't enjoy mean-spirited comedy. Parks and Rec was never about characters being mean to one another. Sure, they make fun of one another, but it's always lighthearted and never meant to be cruel. Politics aside, Schur was also excited to build a show around the friendship between Leslie and Ann. Their chemistry worked so well because Poehler and Jones are friends in real life. This may break your heart to hear, but Pawnee, Indiana is not a real place. Instead, most of the buildings in Pawnee were in Pasadena, Studio City, or Van Nuys, all places in Los Angeles County. Pawnee City Hall, for example, is actually just Pasadena City Hall. Pawnee is roughly based on the actual east central Indiana town of Mancy. In season 1, the map of Pawnee was just a map of Mancy flipped upside down. Even naming other fictional towns was carefully rooted in actual small town Indiana. For instance, to name Eagleton, fact checker Greg Levine pieced together names of actual Indiana towns and presented a list to Daniels and Schur. When a more detailed map of Pawnee had to be drawn, an unlikely town doppelganger was used: Christchurch, New Zealand. The graphic designer responsible for the map had visited Christchurch and thought it was the correct size and shape for Pawnee. Once the conception phase of the show was over, Daniels stepped back and gave control of the show entirely to Schur. In other words, Schur became the sole showrunner, while Daniels hung back as a producer. Even with the tweaks, most people agree that the first season of Parks and Rec was a little shaky. Parks and Rec didn't start getting a steady following until its second season. But then, oh man, the praise poured in. New York Magazine called it the most impressive comeback in the history of broadcast comedy. As far as Schur saw it, there were two major shifts in between seasons 1 and 2 of Parks and Rec. First, audiences were reading Leslie as ditzy, which was never the team's intent, so the writers adjusted to make sure Leslie came off as smart and good at her job. Poehler herself was instrumental in making Leslie come off as smarter. She and Schur had a lot of discussions on the subject. The writers also spent a ton of time in the writer's room doing trial and error. The second shift was about Andy Dwyer. Originally, he wasn't going to make it past season 1. Ann was going to dump him, and that would be it. But Chris Pratt was so hilarious that the Parks and Rec team rewrote his character to be more lovable and to stick around. Fans loved Andy, and even the cast and crew adored Pratt. Amy Poehler even said that Pratt's audition was the best she'd ever seen. They decided to make Andy a regular on the show right after Pratt was cast. So yeah, Parks and Rec was Chris Pratt's breakout role, but it wasn't his big break. That came from his role as Bright Abbott on the WB show Everwood, and he evolved from there. On day 1, Jerry and Donna didn't have much personality to them. Writers didn't have Jerry's figured out until the season 2 episode, Practice Date. Schur didn't want things to get too mean, so allowed this excessive dumping on Jerry under a few conditions. First, there needed to be an episode written down the road that showed the people in the Parks department actually cared about him, which became Park Safety. The other way that Schur felt comfortable with the constant hits on Jerry was to secretly give him the best life of anyone at the office. That's why his wife is played by model Christy Brinkley. Like Jim O'Heir, Retta was cast as Donna purely because Schur liked her so much. As the series went on, Retta began to think of Donna as the voice of the audience of the show. Credit for the Ron Swanson-ness of Ron Swanson goes largely to Nick Offerman himself, who, in Schur's words, is also an incredibly interesting guy. A few details, like Ron's affinity for woodworking, are straight from Offerman's real life. Nick Offerman founded and runs a small woodworking collective out of Los Angeles called Offerman Woodshop. The writers visited the shop, and you can even buy his wares online. Now, I won't blame you for buying a coffee table from Ron Swanson himself, but there's no excuse to do so without first protecting yourself. With ExpressVPN, you'll be able to safely shop online while keeping your personal information protected. Even Ron Swanson could do with a little extra cybersecurity. I'm sure he'd prefer to be off the grid entirely, but ExpressVPN is the next best thing. It encrypts all internet data. That way, Ron can special order all the scotch he wants. I'm no scotch drinker, but I can still use ExpressVPN to watch shows that aren't normally available, like Brooklyn Nine-Nine, which is on Netflix in the UK. But that doesn't stop me and shouldn't stop you either. Find out how you can get 3 months free at expressvpn.com/cinematica. Of course, we can't talk about Ron Swanson without discussing his alter ego, Duke Silver. The smooth jazz man came purely because the writers discovered that Offerman can also play the saxophone. What about all that, unhealthy food? Well, that's Offerman's secret superpower. Offerman says he's blessed with a mighty constitution which allows me to consume dangerously large quantities of cholesterol. Apparently, Ron has only ever cried twice in his life. Once when he was 7 and got hit by a bus, and again when little Sebastian died. For better or for worse, it's hard to forget Ron's essentially orgasmic reaction to receiving a shoe shine from Andy and the camel. Oh. That scene was filmed tons of times, and Offerman made a different, highly uncomfortable sound every take. Uncomfortable for both Pratt,
what the man?
And Offerman.
Sometimes a sound is just a sound.
Originally, Ron's character was going to be more antagonistic, especially towards Leslie. But as you've now seen, what Offerman brought to the character was so much fun that the writers decided it would be much more satisfying to explore a friendship between Leslie and Ron. Every year, Poehler and Offerman filmed a scene where Leslie and Ron make out, purely for the gag reel. But these scenes never made it to the gag reel because, in Schur's words, it's super disgusting to watch. Of all the characters who evolved in the early seasons, April probably changed the most. In the episode Hunting Trip, Chris Pratt was determined to make Aubrey Plaza crack, and the chemistry worked like a charm. Aubrey Plaza came to be on Parks and Rec because Allison Jones, one of the casting directors, called Schur during the first season and told him, "I just met the weirdest girl I've ever met in my life. You have to meet her and put her on your show." Plaza and Schur spent an awkward hour together in his office, and he was convinced. At first, Schur didn't know what to do with Plaza and her character. He just thought it would be funny if Leslie was trying to inspire her college-aged intern, but as the show went on, everyone realized Plaza was capable of much more than eye-rolling. April typically flips through magazines instead of working, but she's not just pretending. Plaza is actually reading what's placed in front of her. In fact, she read an entire Stephen King novel in Season 2. Characters were added to the series in Season 2 as well, like Rob Lowe's character, Chris Traeger. Lowe was originally only going to be a guest star for just 8 episodes, but Chris is so freaking wonderful that Lowe quickly became a series regular. Chris and Ann's relationship was designed as a chance for Rashida Jones to show off her comedy chops. Schur commented, "Rashida is very intelligent, and it's hard to knock someone like that off balance. And the way to knock that person off balance is to get Rob Lowe in a relationship with you." Chris's underling auditor, Ben Wyatt, also became a series regular. Wyatt's actor, Adam Scott, had to give up his lead role in a purely hypothetical and ultimately doomed 3rd season of Party Down to be on Parks and Rec. But he loved Parks and Rec, so he couldn't say no. We all know Ben's backstory. He was elected mayor at 18 and quickly got impeached for bankrupting his town. But that was originally Leslie's backstory. Schur kept the idea in his back pocket because he thought it was comedy gold for a mid-level government worker. Of course, Parks and Rec also has its fair number of guest stars. In the Season 2 episode, The Setup, Will Arnett played an obnoxious MRI technician who goes on a blind date with Leslie. Sure, Arnett starred in beloved comedies like Arrested Development, but he was also Poehler's real-life husband at the time. Poehler wasn't the only cast member to have their real-life spouse play a failed romance. Nick Offerman's wife and Will and Grace star, Megan Mullally, plays Tammy too, one of Ron Swanson's ex-wives. By the way, you too can cheer yourself up at Jurassic Fork. Well, not exactly, but the restaurant was shot at the historic Clifton's Cafeteria in downtown LA. Even though you won't find any dinosaurs, there's still plenty there that's quite interesting. Jahn didn't quite become a series regular, but the writers kept bringing him back to play with Ben Schwartz. Schwartz loves that while the other characters were becoming more human, Jahn instead becomes more cartoonish over time. One character ended up getting entirely written off Parks and Rec after Season 2 was over. Mark Brendanowitz. Schur said it was to make space for Paul Schneider's film career, but Schneider also expressed that he was struggling to dig into the character because he didn't know Mark's motivations. So much for those City Hall trips then. Season 2 also signaled a huge shift in the show's writing style. The writers made a conscious effort to be much more topical, which Schur thought made sense for a show about government. And that's how we got gay penguins. Viewers were surprised that the pit was filled in the 6th episode of the 2nd season. Everyone expected it would be a central plot point of the entire show. Schur decided to rush the process ahead of what he initially imagined to just get rid of the thing and allow the show to explore different places. Using projects like The Pit and the Harvest Festival to draw the characters together comes from Schur's favorite show, The Wire. The idea that The Wire inspired Parks and Rec comes up constantly in his interviews. Come on, anyone could see the similarities. There were a few other surprising influences as well. The writers often drew from The Contender, a dramatic film about a female vice president, as an example of what it's like to be a woman in politics, surrounded by men. The disturbing spirit of Pawnee mural was inspired by Daniel's experience touring some public buildings while attending a wedding in Oklahoma. Daniel said those murals were a little racist, and Parks and Rec just exaggerated the idea. Amy Poehler can truly do it all. In Season 2, she started writing episodes like Telethon, The Fight, The Debate, Second Chance, and the finale, One Last Ride. She would even direct some episodes too. But more cast members penned episodes too. Offerman wrote Lucky in season 4, and Adam Scott wrote Farmer's Market in season 6. And to be fair, the show's writers, occasionally got on-screen cameos. The Harvest Festival arc came to be because Poehler was pregnant with her second child. So instead of stopping at the end of season 2, the crew only took 3 weeks off before rolling straight into filming the first 6 episodes of season 3. Aside from the Harvest Festival, Schur added Leslie's budding romantic relationship with Ben to give this little mini-season some shape. Poehler likens the situation to a single mother, since Pawnee is like Leslie's kid. Once a single mother sees the guy lift the kid on his shoulders, she's pretty hooked. Literally everyone was pleased that Leslie and Ben didn't play Will They Won't They for several seasons. They kiss, fall in love, and get married the way life happens, as Poehler said, because Park's writing is so active. To draw inspiration for Leslie and Ben's budding romance, Schur watched The Remains of Day, a very serious British drama about a love forbidden by Anthony Hopkins' service as a butler. It seems like a strange muse, but Schur thought Leslie's career as a public servant was kind of like being a butler. You might have noticed that Leslie's wardrobe is a little, pantsuit heavy. That's entirely on purpose. Poehler says that, as a rule, if she puts on an outfit and thinks it's cute, then it's not right for Leslie. After 8 years of playing different characters on SNL, Poehler reveled in playing the same character week after week. She was excited about the luxury of staying with one person, finding out who she is. The name Leslie Knope was crafted very purposefully. Daniel says he thought it was funny that such an optimistic person would have such a negative name. Of course, you can't talk about Leslie without mentioning her slightly bizarre, obsessive crush on former Vice President Joe Biden. Leslie's obsession started as a joke in the writer's room during the show's infancy, but the idea really took hold, and the writers just went nuts with it. I wonder how Leslie would feel about old Joe now. Biden himself actually ended up making 2 cameos in the show, one in the season 5 episode Leslie vs. April, and again in the series finale, at some point in 2025 after Leslie and Ben moved to Washington. The Debate is one of only 2 Parks and Rec episodes to be nominated for an Outstanding Emmy in Comedy Writing, and that episode was written by Amy Poehler. The other episode was Schur's Win, Lose, or Draw. Win, Lose, or Draw had 3 distinct endings written for it. One where Leslie won the city council election, one where she lost, and one where she and her Paul Rudd rival tied. Schur wanted options and to safeguard the result from leaking. Only 2 of the endings were shot, the winning and the losing. The team had decided that Leslie would win 2 weeks before the scenes were shot, and not without a lot of debates and soul-searching. Schur estimates he must have had 30 conversations with Poehler about it, and another 100 conversations in the writer's room. The detail that convinced Schur that Leslie would win came after a conversation with a member of the Indiana State House of Representatives. They informed Schur that Leslie would legally be able to keep her job at the Parks Department while also serving as a city councilor. By some grave injustice of the universe, Parks and Rec never won an Emmy. Poehler was nominated for her role as Leslie every dang year from 2010 to 2015, yet was snubbed every time. And yeah, I'm still mad about it. At least that disappointment inspired one of the most romantic scenes in TV history. Just after everyone had filmed the scene with Joe Biden, the first time, they all learned that they hadn't even been nominated for the Emmy for Best Comedy, which critics actively expected them to win. Despite the low morale, Schur announced he was going back to his hotel room and proceeded to write Ben's proposal. Schur wrote both Ben's proposal and Leslie and Ben's wedding, assuming that the show would be canceled and that either episode could wind up as the series finale, which explains why they feel a little finale-ish. The writers had planned for Ben to pop the question at some point in season 5 before the season even began. Schur originally thought about having Ben propose by singing It's Not Unusual alongside a white tiger. Ben and Leslie aren't the only characters who grew up over the course of the show. Tom finally became a successful businessman. You can go to Tom's Bistro in real life, well, sort of. Delancey's Pizzeria in Hollywood served as both the interior and exterior of one of Tom's few successful business ventures, although a set mimicking the interior was later constructed. Jerry may not have a successful business, but who needs it when you've got such a happy home life? One thing Jerry does have? A fart attack in season 5. Schur estimates that he and the team spent 10 to 12 hours just working on the farts. There are a ton of fart sound effects to choose from, and after all, you only get to do a fart attack once. One of the most memorable guest moments in the entire show is Patton Oswalt's filibuster. He pitches an alternative version of Star Wars Episode 7, and the whole thing is 100% improvised, which means all of that Star Wars and Marvel knowledge was just in his brain. It was Pratt's favorite improvisation of the entire show. Even in Season 6, characters that were only supposed to be guest stars ended up becoming regulars. Billy Eichner's character, Craig Middlebrooks, was initially only going to be around for a few episodes, but seriously, how can you not have Crazy Craig? The Season 6 finale was perhaps one of the most star-studded in the history of an already star-studded show. Other than Jon Hamm, we'll get to him in a second, you have Genuine, The Decemberists, and frickin' Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama has a lasting soft spot for the show, She posted about Galentine's Day as recently as this year. To wrap up the series, Season 7, and the last part of the last episode of Season 6, takes place a few years in the future. Season 6 aired in 2014, in real time, but Season 7, which aired in 2015, takes place in 2017. Make sense? Poehler suggested the time skip for a surprising yet incredibly understandable reason. As the real-life mother of 2 toddlers, she didn't want to have, quote, another year of babies. Especially since Leslie and Ben were slated to have triplets. Schur decided to reveal the time skip at the end of Season 6 instead of the start of Season 7 to create momentum into the show's final season. Also, NBC assured him that they weren't going to suddenly up and cancel the show. After the time skip, Leslie works for the National Park Service, and one of the first things she has to do is fire a screw-up employee, Jahn. Jahn was Schur's dream casting for the role, because he loved the idea that we had just skipped over 3 years of Jahn being on Parks and Rec. Despite the future setting, Schur wanted to keep the show lightly science fiction. He ordered the writers to keep out hoverboards and the like, which, considering it was only a couple years in the future, seems fair. Jean-Ralphio was supposed to be in the first episode of Season 7. Schwartz got outrageous blonde highlights and rolled in on a wheelchair, but Schur felt like it was just too crazy for this to be the first thing anyone sees in this jump to the future. Schur and Poehler co-wrote the series finale, but because Poehler was constantly shooting her scenes, they were rarely able to be in the same room writing together, so they ended up splitting up the episode scenes. Everyone in the finale got the heartfelt send-off they deserved, but what happened to Jean-Ralphio? Schur teased that there was a deeply hidden clue in the finale, and one fan found it, a bottle of Jean-Ralphio champagne. A few characters had different endings pitched than the ones they ultimately ended up with. For example, Ben was maybe going to become the mayor of Pawnee, and April was maybe going to replace Leslie in the Parks Department. Except Aubrey Plaza protested, saying she didn't think April ends her story in public service. Some fans were disappointed that Chris and Ann didn't get their own flash forward. Schur said the team tried to write one in, but couldn't make it satisfying and not disorienting within the structure of the episode. He said it felt more important for them to show up at the 2025 reunion and have room to breathe as characters. The big question on everyone's minds after the series finale was that tease about President Leslie Knope, or Ben, but come on, Leslie. But Schur has no desire to clarify that for anyone, because he was heavily influenced by the ending of The Sopranos. He wanted Parks and Rec's finale to have just one big, ambiguous, epic, unanswered question. We may never meet President Knope, but I wouldn't mind having her around right about now. This has been 107 Facts about Parks and Recreation. We love making videos like these, so hit subscribe to stay in the loop. And remember, Frederator loves you.